In our timeline, a single severed head changed the course of human history forever. When Louis XVI's head dropped into the basket on January 21, 1793, it triggered a cascade of consequences that shaped every war, every democracy, every revolution that followed. But what if that blade never fell? What if the powder keg of 1789 Paris somehow didn't explode? The answer is far more disturbing than you might imagine. Because without the French Revolution, the entire architecture of the modern world collapses. No Napoleon, no independence movements across Latin America, no concept of universal human rights as we know them. Democracy itself might have remained a quaint experiment confined to one rebellious British colony across the Atlantic. You're about to witness the alternate timeline where monarchy never died, and discover why some historians believe we'd still be living under kings and queens today. France in 1788 teetered on financial ruin. The American Revolution had cost the French treasury dearly. 3 billion livres invested in humiliating Britain, but bankrupting Paris in the process. King Louis XVI faced an impossible choice: default on debts or tax the nobility who'd never paid taxes in their lives. In our timeline, he chose neither and lost everything. But imagine an alternate June 1789. The Estates General convenes at Versailles, tensions are nuclear, the Third Estate is about to break away and form the National Assembly. This is the moment, the spark that ignites everything. Except, what if Louis XVI actually possessed his great-grandfather's political cunning? What if, instead of indecisiveness, he made one strategic concession? Imagine he grants the Third Estate limited voting reforms, agrees to a constitutional monarchy on his own terms, and most crucially, imposes a modest tax on church lands and noble estates. The rage diffuses. The spark never catches. The revolutionaries, given just enough to hope for gradual reform, stand down. The king remains. The guillotine stays a medieval relic. By 1795, in this alternate timeline, France has become something unprecedented, a constitutional monarchy with real teeth. Louis XVI, having avoided the guillotine, now rules alongside an elected parliament drawn from property owners and the educated bourgeoisie. It's not democracy as we know it. Women can't vote, neither can the poor, but it's evolution rather than revolution. The nobility grumbles but adapts, investing their wealth in the emerging industrial revolution sweeping across from Britain. French factories rise along the Seine. The church, stripped of some landholdings, reluctantly modernizes. There are no September massacres, no reign of terror, no streets running red with aristocratic blood. Sounds almost peaceful, doesn't it? But here's what no one tells you about avoiding revolution. The pressure doesn't disappear. It doesn't evaporate because a king made one good decision. It goes underground. It festers. And across France, in taverns and meeting halls, a new generation grows up not with the memory of revolutionary triumph, but with the bitter taste of a compromise that changed far too little, far too slowly. In our timeline, a young Corsican artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte exploited revolutionary chaos to become Emperor of France and reshape Europe through conquest. In this timeline, he's a footnote. Without the Revolutionary Wars creating opportunities for ambitious military men, Napoleon remains a competent but unremarkable officer in Louis XVI's reformed royal army. He never commands the army of Italy, never crowns himself emperor, never marches on Moscow. The entire Napoleonic era, that 20-year explosion of warfare that killed 3 million people and redrew the map of Europe, simply doesn't happen. Britain and France settle into an uneasy coexistence, competing for colonies but avoiding continental war. The German states remain fragmented under Habsburg influence. Russia continues its slow westward expansion unopposed. Spain keeps its iron grip on Latin America. And here's the truly staggering part. Without Napoleon's invasions sparking nationalist awakenings across Europe, the entire concept of the nation-state might never have taken hold. Europe could have remained a patchwork of dynastic empires well into the 20th century. perhaps even to this day. The French Revolution gave the world more than guillotines and Napoleonic warfare. It birthed ideas so powerful they're still shaping our world. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, the rights of man and of the citizen. The radical notion that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, not divine right. In our alternate timeline, these Enlightenment ideals remain what they were before 1789. Interesting theories debated in salons and banned books. Rousseau, Voltaire, Diderot. They're still read by intellectuals, but their ideas never explode into the streets. They never get stress-tested in the crucible of real revolution. The American Revolution stands alone as a democratic experiment, isolated across the Atlantic, often dismissed by European monarchs as a frontier curiosity that couldn't possibly scale to civilized society. Without the French proving that an entire European nation could overthrow monarchy and survive, the divine right of kings limps into the 19th century wounded but alive. And the consequences echo across continents. Because ideas need more than philosophers. They need martyrs. They need the blood of tyrants and patriots to water the tree of liberty, as Thomas Jefferson wrote. Without that blood sacrifice in France, liberty itself remains anemic. In our timeline, the French Revolution's ideological shockwaves destabilized empires worldwide. Napoleon's invasion of Spain created the power vacuum that allowed Simón Bolívar and other liberators to free South America. Revolutionary ideals inspired Greek independence, the 1848 revolutions, Italian and German unification. The entire 19th century became a cascade of nationalist uprisings against empire. But remove the French Revolution from history, and that cascade never begins. Spain, Portugal, France, and Britain maintain their colonial empires with renewed vigor. There's no liberator myth, no proven template for successful revolution against European powers. South America enters the 20th century still divided into Spanish and Portuguese colonies. Imagine Brazil, Argentina, and Chile as provinces of European empires during World War I. The implications are staggering. The Belgian Congo's atrocities under Leopold II, they become the norm, not the exception. The entire vocabulary of anti-imperialism, self-determination, and decolonization might never develop. The British Empire, never forced to reckon with French revolutionary ideology undermining its own legitimacy, potentially survives intact into the modern era. Picture a world where the sun truly never sets on empires that should have crumbled a century ago. But here's what the monarchists in this alternate timeline fail to understand. You cannot suppress the fundamental human desire for dignity and self-determination forever. The Industrial Revolution still happens. Factories still concentrate workers in cities. Literacy still spreads. Newspapers still print. And without the revolutionary release valve of 1789, the pressure builds across Europe for an entire century. By 1889, exactly 100 years after our timeline's revolution should have occurred, France in this alternate world is a constitutional monarchy with a facade of reform hiding a deeply unequal society. The King's Parliament represents perhaps 5% of the population. Workers have no unions, no vote, no voice. And then the match strikes. Perhaps it's a factory collapse killing hundreds. Perhaps it's a famine exacerbated by noble hoarding. Perhaps it's simply the weight of a century of patience exhausted. But when this delayed revolution finally erupts, it makes 1789 look tame. Because now the revolutionaries have machine guns. They have a century of pent-up rage. They have ideological texts smuggled from the one democratic beacon, America, that have been fermenting in secret for generations. And this time the kings don't just lose their thrones, they lose everything. Historians who study revolutionary cycles have a grim observation. Delayed revolutions are almost always bloodier. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, it had Enlightenment philosophy as its intellectual foundation. There was genuine debate about constitutional forms, separation of powers, rights-based frameworks. But a revolution erupting in the industrial age, after a century of suppression, It would be driven by different ideologies entirely. Marx published the Communist Manifesto in 1848. In our alternate timeline, his ideas wouldn't face competition from French revolutionary republicanism. They'd be the primary ideology of resistance. Imagine the French Revolution, but communist from the start. Not the relatively moderate Republicans of 1789, but hardline collectivists who have been radicalized by a century of industrial capitalism under monarchical protection. The terror wouldn't last months, it could last decades. The executions wouldn't number in thousands, but potentially hundreds of thousands. And most terrifyingly, this ultra-violent French communist revolution would become the model that spreads across Europe, not the relatively liberal model of our timeline. The 20th century's totalitarian nightmares might have started 50 years earlier, and with no democratic traditions to resist them. And now we arrive at the most unsettling implication of all. World War I, in our timeline, was partly triggered by the unfinished business of Napoleon's reshaping of Europe, the German unification he inadvertently enabled, the nationalist movements his conquests inspired, the balance of power his empire disrupted and never quite restored. Without Napoleon, without the French Revolution, Europe's political landscape entering the 20th century would be radically different. Germany might still be dozens of small states. Italy might never unify. The Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, never challenged by revolutionary nationalism, could remain powerful. Does this prevent World War I? Possibly. Or does it make something worse? Because eventually, that delayed French Revolution we explored erupts. And in this timeline, it's happening while the rest of Europe still operates under the old monarchical order. Imagine the crowned heads of Europe, German Kaisers, Russian czars, British kings, facing not a liberal republic, but a communist France armed with early 20th century weapons. The ideological warfare alone could trigger a conflict, making our World War I look like a border skirmish. And without the democratic traditions established by the French Revolution, who exactly would fight for freedom against totalitarianism? So here's the uncomfortable truth our journey through this alternate timeline reveals. The French Revolution, for all its horrors, the guillotines, the terror, the rivers of blood, may have been necessary. Not morally necessary, but historically necessary. Like a fever that burns out an infection, it released a century of pressure in a single explosive decade rather than letting it build to something far worse. It gave the world a vocabulary for human rights when that vocabulary was still tied to Enlightenment rationalism rather than industrial age extremism. It proved that monarchy could end without civilization collapsing. Perhaps most importantly, it failed in just the right ways, violently enough to terrify absolute monarchs into reform, but not so completely that it destroyed the possibility of gradual evolution elsewhere. Britain saw the terror and reformed rather than face revolution. Other European monarchies slowly adopted constitutions, extended suffrage, negotiated with rising democratic movements. Without the French Revolution as both inspiration and warning, we might live in a world where kings still claim divine right, or where they were overthrown so violently and recently that democracy never had time to take root. Sometimes the nightmare you know saves you from the nightmare you can't imagine. The guillotine's blade, in the end, may have cut a path to a freer world than any peaceful reform ever could have. History doesn't have clean answers, only blood-written lessons for those willing to read them.